Welcome back, everybody. Now, their humour won them legions of fans back in the 1920s and beyond. And now Laurel and Hardy are having a bit of a moment.
There's a film starring Steve Coogan as Stan Laurel, which will be released next year. And this week sees the publication of a book inspired by a very complicated man behind that clumsy, childlike character he played on screen. The
author of that book is John Connolly. Delighted to say he joins us on the sofa this morning.
Thank you for having me.
It's fair to say, John, that you've been fascinated particularly by Stan Laurel for such a long time. Where did that begin for you?
Probably with the BBC, of all things. I'm from that generation that remembers when the racing in Haydock Park was cancelled because of rain. The BBC would stick on 20 minutes of Laurel and Hardy, so I grew up with them. And then I was staying with a bookseller friend in 1999. And he said the only thing he'd ever regret, he was one of those weird people, collected lots of stuff. His house was filled with junk. Americans call it antiques. He said the only thing he regretted losing was a hat that Stan Laurel had given him. And it had never struck me that someone could have met Stan Laurel because I associated him with this kind of black and white era. But he kept his name in the Santa Monica phone book. He liked people to come and visit. He liked that he wasn't forgotten. And you could call him and say, do you mind if my son comes around, or do you mind if I come around? And you'd make an appointment and come around and he'd make you tea. And if he really liked you, he'd give you a little cheap derby hat that you could take away with you. And that was the beginning of it. And I thought, what was he doing for all of those years? Because Oliver Hardy obviously died 8 years before he did. And effectively what he did was, I think he grieved. I think he stayed, he refused to work, he wouldn't do interviews, because I think he always felt that he had been defined by this other man. And if people saw him alone on the couch, they would go, where's the other half?
There was a magic to them, wasn't there? I think I never think it's a bad time to recapture a bit of that marriage.
Yeah, sure,
magic. Let's just see.
Why don't you watch where you're going?
Marvellous. Their friendship really was something, wasn't it?
It was, and I think that's one of the things that comes out when you watch them on screen. I think we see the fact that they actually did like each other. You know, we lost Jerry Lewis this week, who's obviously, you know, one of those great stars. But he and Dean Martin had a very fractious relationship. Abbott and Costello, a very fractious relationship. They ended up suing each other. Laurel and Hardy never argued. Apparently they only argued once, and it was about the degree of dishevelment that was permitted to Oliver Hardy's hair. You know, they didn't fight. Stan Laurel knew, I think, that Oliver Hardy was the better actor. Because Oliver Hardy used to work as a projectionist, so he knew that if you did a tiny gesture on screen, it showed huge in front of the audience. Stan Laurel was a product of the English Music Hall theatres in vaudeville. He was always playing for the back row. And so he tailored the script so that Oliver Hardy would get the best lines. There was no vanity or ego about him. And I think that was lovely. They both recognised strengths in each other, and they both made each other. You know, Oliver Hardy had been a jobbing actor. It had never really happened for him. Stan Laurel was being groomed for stardom. It never really happened for him either. It was only together that they were able to create this wonderful partnership.
And he was quite a complicated character, wasn't he? Married 5 times.
5 times, twice to the same woman, yeah. Which is the triumph of optimism over experience in a huge way. And, you know, Oliver Hardy was married 3 times. They both had long-standing affairs with other women. Yeah, they did. Yeah, and I think that's what's so difficult for us, because we see them on screen and we consider them as these quite naive, almost childlike characters. And yet in real life they were complicated men with difficult adult problems. They went through grief and loss. And the only thing I think that sustained them was their friendship, which grew closer and closer as the years went on.
I think what's interesting in the book as well is it touches upon other characters of the age and their dislike, or Stan's dislike, of Charlie Chaplin. And he learned some things about Charlie Chaplin that are quite surprising.
I think he hugely admired Chaplin. He had been Chaplin's understudy and they had roomed together. But Chaplin came from a completely different background. Massive poverty, huge rage, I think, in Chaplin. And also Chaplin, as a friend of mine said, you know, if nowadays he'd be in Operation U-Tree would be investigating. You know, he had a predilection for young girls. And I think it must have been very difficult for Stan Laurel for this man he hugely admired as a comedian. And then he had to look at his life and say, well, you can be a great artist, but not necessarily a great human being. And I think that's the problem with Chaplin.
Why did you call the book He? What's the significance of that title?
Because for most of his life, Stan Laurel lived under the name of Arthur Jefferson. It was the name he was born under in Ulverston, Lancashire. He took Stan Laurel as a stage name when he was living with his common-law wife. So Stan Laurel was a kind of construct. He didn't really exist at all. And then he kind of left Arthur Jefferson behind. And somewhere between those two identities, I think, this young man who had grown up in Ulverston, Lancashire as the son of a theatre manager, who then ended up in Hollywood as this huge star, somewhere in between was this identity. And so I couldn't figure out what, you can't really call him Stan Laurel because he wasn't that for a long time and he left Arthur Jefferson behind. So he's he in the book.
And he called Hardy Babe.
Babe was the name that Oliver Hardy's friends all called him Babe. And I think it was a name he came up with, Oliver Hardy came up with himself, so people couldn't call him Chubby or Tubby. He was very conscious of his weight. So he made up a story about a barber slapping his cheeks and saying, "You look like a little baby." And it was a way to avoid having one of those dreadful nicknames, because I think he was always, like some large people are, always very conscious of his weight, you know. And he had his vanities, but they were very small vanities and very understandable ones, I think.
So knowing what you know about him now, and then sharing this with many other people as well, do you watch the footage in a slightly different way?
I can see the artistry of it now, in a way. I think I took them for granted before, but Stan Laurel, effectively wrote, directed and edited all of those short films. He was the kind of creative genius behind the partnership, and then he tailored them to bring out Oliver Hardy's strength. So when I look at them now, and now that I know so much about their friendship, I think I see that friendship reflected. I see the gentleness and the loyalty in them and something genuine about those lovely short films. And I think, it's interesting that they both had such unhappy married lives, and in the films they're often in unhappy relationships with women. And I sometimes think maybe he found a way to take the unhappiness of his life and turn it into comedy in his films.
It's quite difficult to imagine that level of superstardom of that age, but they really were. Women would flock to them.
Particularly Stan Laurel, what we don't realise is he was a very handsome man. He had astonishing blue eyes that women just fell for. So he was quite successful with the ladies. When they came back to England after the Second World War, they arrived in Southampton Docks through fog, and they could hear whistling, and it was thousands upon thousands of people standing on Southampton Docks whistling their theme tune to welcome them in, which is quite a beautiful image. They came back to England, and England loved them. England was so delighted. They were I think two of the biggest stars to come back after the Second World War, when there was still rationing, when people were still conscious of the loss, and to have these two beautiful men arrive and just cheer them up, they were lauded.
When you watch that old footage, you realise how Stan Laurel had the most remarkably expressive eyebrows to me. And we talk about Roger Moore's wonderful Bond eyebrow, but you can see it there in the picture behind us. It was something he used to express all sorts of emotions.
They both did, and I think he learned a lot of that from Oliver Hardy, because
Oliver Hardy was
the one who realised that actually you could just look at the camera and open your eyes slightly wide, and everybody in the audience would understand your pain. That was what was lovely about him. And so I think Stan Laurel became a better actor because of Oliver Hardy.
20 years in the making, your book.
Pretty much, yeah. A lot of research, a lot of thinking, and it could have been twice as long. They were fascinating lives.
It's a very interesting read indeed. Thank you very much, John. John's book is called He.
It's a great read. That is about it from us. We'll be back tomorrow morning from 6 o'clock.